Time now for today's business news. We're joined by Yuka Arroyo. Yuka, Argentina has avoided defaulting on its debt repayment.
Buenos Aires has reached a deal with its international creditors to avoid defaulting on about $2.4 billion worth of debt repayment when a grace period would have expired at the end of July. Instead, it will pay just a fraction of that amount in the short term and the rest later on. Catherine Viet has more.
A sigh of relief in Buenos Aires after the government negotiated a deal to avoid defaulting on its debt repayment. Argentina was expected to pay $2.4 billion by the end of July, but now it will pay just $430 million, with the rest to come later. The country's economy minister praised the deal.
Paying that amount would have been a blow to our international reserves and therefore would have generated more exchange rate instability and more macroeconomic instability in general.
Argentina will now have until March to repay the remainder of the debt to the so-called Paris Club of Creditors, which includes the U.S., Germany, Japan, and France. This follows last year's successful restructuring of some $65 billion in debt owed to private creditors. The deal will provide some breathing room for the country's struggling economy, which has been in a recession since 2018, a situation only made worse by the coronavirus pandemic. Last year, GDP fell nearly 10%, and annual inflation is running at almost 49%. Meanwhile, Argentina is still in talks with the International Monetary Fund about repaying the $45 billion it was loaned under the previous government in 2018.
Well, the head of the US Federal Reserve gave his reassurances that the recent rise in inflation would only be temporary and will wane. Not everyone, though, Yuka, seems convinced.
Well, there have been a lot of jitters lately since consumer prices in the United States jumped 5% last month compared to a year earlier. Now, Jerome Powell told Congress that he believed the high inflation levels that we were seeing were linked to the post-lockdown economic reopening and would settle closer to the long-term goal of around 2%. A market analyst earlier told us in our program that there's doubt over whether Powell's official comments give the whole picture.
Despite Powell's reassurances, I think the Fed dot plot that we saw from last week's meeting tells us a different story. I mean, the fact that enough of Powell's colleagues are penciling in not just one, but two U.S. interest rate hikes by 2023 is in stark contrast to the expectations that we had coming into this year. So I think market participants are now viewing the Fed's commentary with a new lens, so to speak, given what we have learned from last week's Fed meeting.
Well, despite those lingering doubts, financial markets have welcomed Powell's remarks. Here in Europe, major indices started trading on a positive note, tracking Wall Street. FTSE up 0.25% at the open. On the French market, Pernod Ricard rose 4% at the open after upgrading their financial outlook for the current year. Earlier, Asian markets also gained. Hong Kong shares recovered from Tuesday's loss, up around 1.5%. Tokyo falling just below the flat line towards the end of trading, but that comes after a 3% rise in the previous session.
Moving on now to a controversial move by the world's largest investment bank.
Morgan Stanley, the bank, has reportedly decided not to allow staff and clients to enter its New York offices unless they're fully vaccinated. Employees who are not fully immunized will have to work remotely. The new policy will come into effect next month, and in return, some COVID restrictions that are currently in place are expected to be lifted. It comes just days after the bank's CEO called on staff to come back to the office.
Meanwhile, the European Union is moving ahead with its €750 billion coronavirus recovery fund.
Well, Germany and Italy have been approved to receive emergency aid now that their spending plans have met EU requirements for digital and green investment. Italy will receive €191 billion in a mix of grants and loans. That's the largest slice among the bloc. Germany will be getting around €26 billion. The two nations join Spain, Portugal, Greece and Denmark, which have already received the green light from the Commission for their requests. Let's take a listen to the Commission's head, Ursula von der Leyen.
You have helped each other make it through the crisis. And by doing so, You have inspired a whole continent. You showed the true meaning of the word solidarity. And the rest of Europe is following your way. Next Generation EU is an exceptional response to an exceptional crisis. And it can reshape our continent for decades ahead.
Well, von der Leyen is actually currently on a tour of Europe, around those nations that have requested the aid from the European Union, including France. She will be in Paris today, later on, to discuss COVID recovery with President Emmanuel Macron.
Yuka Royer with our business update. Thanks indeed for that. Let's turn our attention now to the international newspapers. Solange Mijan joins us for a press review. And Solange, you're going to start, in fact, with the German papers and the football body UEFA's decision to reject plans to colour a stadium in the rainbow colours.
Yeah, and why not? That is the question that the German paper Der Tagesspiegel is asking today on its front page. For the rainbow lights would have been in support of the LGBTQ community and in protest against an anti-homosexuality law that's been passed in Hungary. Now, the paper Bild is also condemning the move, saying UEFA talks a lot about tolerance, but in truth, it's more focused on business than it is on values. And the paper says that the group's rejection of the rainbow flag under the guise that it seeks to be politically neutral, well, it doesn't really stand up. That it's no problem for politically linked advertising, like, for example, Qatar Airways or Russia's Gazprom, for them to go with those. So Bild argues that what is at play here is actually, quote, about reinforcing homophobes worldwide.
Gosh, well, the Hungarian law has led many EU nations to call on the European Commission to guarantee the rights of the LGBTQI community.
Yeah, and Le Monde tells us that over a dozen nations in Europe have condemned the law, saying that, quote, it is profoundly worrying. And they've called on the Commission to do what it must through EU courts to protect European citizens' rights. But for the Hungarian paper Blick, this decision is theirs to make, that the law which bans displays and the promotion of homosexuality for those under 18 is misunderstood. The paper cites the Hungarian justice minister who argues that, quote, the right to raise children cannot be taken out of the hands of families or handed to lobby groups. For the Hungarian government, quote, Europe is under pressure from a liberal steam engine. So very, very different views there about human rights coming from the Hungarian government.
Absolutely. Let's turn to some other stories now, Solange. Across in the United States, Republicans didn't even want to talk about a proposed change to the electoral law.
Yeah, and for the cartoonist at the Washington Post, the fact that the bill was blocked in the Senate and the debate was blocked, as Republicans even refused to debate or vote on it, is a pure Republican power grab, one where the U.S. voter is held hostage. But for Breitbart, the conservative site, it was the Democrats who were trying to show their might, that the bill, which would have nationalized voting standards, was, quote, a Democrats' power grab, quoting there Mitch McConnell, the minority leader. And Politico tells us the fact that the bill went nowhere is a failure for the Democrats, that they were hoping that the failure of this legislation, it was expected, well, that it would have sort of turbocharged calls to end what is blocking it, i.e. the filibuster. Now, the fact that in the U.S. Senate, even if you have a majority like the Democrats do, you actually need 60 votes to pass major legislation. So Politico says that the Democrats, their strategy went wrong, that moderate Democrats are still not on board with the progressive idea of ditching the filibuster.
Interesting. Staying in the United States, you spotted in the New York Times today, they have an exclusive article concerning the killing of Jamal Khashoggi.
Yeah, the paper says that the journalist assassins, that they were trained a year before the murder in the United States by a private company, and that the training had received State Department approval. Now, the paper goes on to say that there's no evidence that American officials knew that those Saudis were being trained, that they were part of a crackdown in Saudi Arabia. But the discovery has brought again into question, the paper says, the U.S. military's partnership with repressive governments, and the fact that there is very little oversight in such oversight of who is trained and what that knowledge is done, goes and does once those people go back to their home countries.
On a much lighter note, social media is saying the New York Times is, well, killing it today.
Yeah, killing it not as in murder, as we were talking about earlier, but killing it as in raising the bar in excellence when it comes to writing headlines. An article entitled, "When an Eel Climbs a Ramp to Eat Squid from a Clamp, That's Amore," has gone viral because of the prowess of such a headline. And the actual content of the article, well, it's actually quite interesting as well. It's about how moray eels can actually hunt on land, and they actually have a sneaky second jaw to chomp on their prey. So it is for the Times Amore.
And speaking of love, The Guardian has published a few love letters.
Yeah, there is sort of a Valentine's Day summer love vibe going on at The Guardian today. The first article is a well-researched love letter to Joni Mitchell and her album Blue. It's celebrating its 50th birthday this week. The seminal work still rings true half a century later and is, in my opinion, my very humble opinion, one of the best albums ever made. Now, the second love letter tells the story of Peter and Lisa Marshall. Both of them are in their 50s. They were recently married. Now, there's not much exceptional about that, except for the fact that they were already married. And Peter, who suffers from early onset Alzheimer's, he'd actually forgotten that the woman who was sitting next to him on the couch was his wife. So when he asked her to marry him, as she was his favorite person, it came as a bit of a lovely, albeit tear-jerking, there is a bit of sadness here, surprise. They were wed, and it is a sign, and I'm quoting Joni Mitchell here, that love is touching souls.
Oh, it really is, and quite poignant there,
Yeah.
for sure. Solange Mijan, thanks a lot for that look at the international papers.